Nice day for a drive. A Hetalia fanfic by a lovely anonymous person. Read by me. So, they were finally here. Finally here. Where was here again? Never mind, that wasn't the point. The important part of the sentence wasn't the here, it was the they. Or it could be the were. The they were? No, concentrate. England shook his head, possibly a bad idea because it sent the world spinning, and concentrated hard on clambering out of his tank. He'd already held them up by wrecking his original tank, by crashing it into a tree. No, seriously, he broke a tank by crashing it into a tree. What did they make tanks out of these days? Papier-mâché? France probably did, England giggled to himself, because papier-mâché was French, right? And no, concentrate. Russia was waiting for him, and they had to do this so they could sort it out once and for all. And was getting out of a tank usually this hard? This was fucking hard. He distinctly remembered being able to get out of a tank with no trouble before. He dangled from the hatch and looked down at the cans and bottles littering the cramped space. Oh yeah. He giggled again and then quickly put a hand over his mouth. While still hanging onto the edge of the hatch, one leg hooked over it, he was quickly running out of limbs. He couldn't let Russia hear him giggle. That would be bad. Yes, very bad. He finally managed to haul himself out of the hatch, did a funny kind of roly-slidey thing off the top of the tank and landed, miraculously, on his feet beside it. England stared at the floor for a moment, quite surprised that it was still where it was meant to be, albeit swaying, and not in the place of the sky or any of the other strange things that often seemed to happen to him for some reason that he couldn't at this moment in time put his finger on. England finally straightened. Well, he wasn't strictly speaking straight as such, but he was definitely more upright, even if it was mostly due to the tank he was leaning on. But never mind that, he was facing Russia. Russia, who was leaning against his own tank, drinking from his bottle of vodka, the sly bastard. Why hadn't England thought of that? He'd left his booze in the tank. Perhaps he should go back and get it now? No, too much trouble. Get on with it. Russia! He said loudly, and pushed himself off the tank. Oh, whoa, bad idea. He leant on the tank again. That was a bad way to start. He couldn't start like that. Do it again. Russia! He repeated. Da? Said Russia. This ends now, England said, very sure of himself. Russia looked less sure. He took a swig of his bottle. How can it be ending when it hasn't started yet? He took another swig. England stopped, thought it through, and continued. You're right. He took a deep, steadying breath. Come on, old boy, third time's the charm. Russia! This starts now. Russia nodded and raised the bottle to his lips again. This decides everything. Russia didn't even bother lowering the bottle to nod. Whatever the outcome of this, that's... England fumbled for the end of his sentence. That's what the outcome is, right? Russia completely forewent nodding in favour of draining the bottle. England frowned. That was just plain showing off. Do you agree? Russia peered into the bottom of the bottle and, finding it empty, threw it aside. I agree. Good. England turned to start getting back into his tank. Wait, Russia called, and England turned around again as if he wasn't dizzy enough already. We must shake on it. Oh, yes, all right then. Both of them left the safety of their tanks and staggered into no man's land. Then they stumbled past no man's land and into each other. Russia was very much a solid wall of a man, wasn't he? England had never really had the opportunity to become so physically aware of this fact before. But this was neither the time nor the place for such realizations. They carefully extricated themselves from one another, and once they were both sure that neither of them was going to fall over, they let go of each other. Then they shook hands. It was all very civilized. Race starts now, yes? Russia swayed and placed a hand on England's shoulder so hard he felt like he'd been driven a foot into the ground. Yes, England agreed. Good. Russia pushed off with enough of a push to send England reeling, the lousy cheating sod. England caught himself on the treads of his tank and then began the long climb to get back in. It was a lot further going up than coming down, but oh well, at least Russia's tank was bigger. It would take him way longer to get into. England looked over his shoulder, only to find that Russia was already at the hatch. What? That wasn't possible. Russia was moving with the speed of someone who was sober. That bloody cheat, can't even trust him to be drunk. Except then, Russia decided that the best way of heading down the hatch was, in a fantastic display of drunken logic, head first. England clung hard to the side of his tank as giggles overtook him. But then Russia's engine started and he remembered that he was supposed to be in a race. He scrambled up the side of the tank and slid into the tank with, he thought at least, more grace than Russia. The clinking and crunching of all the bottles and cans he landed on may have attested to a different version of events. Still, he'd left the engine running, so that was something he had over Russia. He'd also chosen a smaller and faster tank, much better suited to racing. But that was only if you counted leaping into the nearest tank when no one was looking as choosing. Then they were off. Well, Russia was already off, but now England was off as well, and quickly catching up. He laughed maniacally as he edged up alongside Russia's, let's face it, behemoth of a tank. Fuck slow and steady, small and nimble had always won the race for England. Unless Russia did that. It was complete luck that they were going slow enough that England's fantastically inadequate reaction time managed to avoid a disaster. "The hell did you do that for?" England shouted. He received no reply from Russia because they were in two entirely separate vehicles of war that weren't made for shouting between and he hadn't been heard. Russia faffed around with his tank's positioning until he was completely perpendicular to the road, blocking off the whole of it. At which point, England decided to sit back and crack open another beer. The hatch on Russia's tank popped open and Russia stuck his head out. He said something, but England couldn't tell what it was. England opened his own hatch and stuck his head out. He kept the beer with him this time, though. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. "What did you say?" he said. "I am stuck," replied Russia. "How can you be stuck? You're in a tank." Just ignore the fact that England was already on his second tank. That was completely irrelevant. And anyway, the circumstances had been entirely different. "If I move forward, there are trees. And if I move back, there are trees." It was a good point. If anything, England had learnt that trees are to be avoided at all costs. He took a mouthful of beer. Russia replied with taking a mouthful from his own bottle. England drank again just because it wouldn't do to let Russia have the last word. Russia also drank again. England frowned and then chugged the whole can, crumbled it in his hand and threw it off to the side. "Do a 3-point turn or something." "Ah, yes," said Russia. "I shall try." He then drank some more, crafty bastard, saving his alcohol like that, and disappeared back inside the tank. Of course, being tanks, both vehicles were perfectly able to turn on a penny, but it never really occurred to either nation as Russia executed his 37-point turn. England watched in amusement and no small amount of thankfulness as it allowed him to get through an entire other can. England saw his chance when Russia was reversing and quickly surged forward through the gap only just large enough for him to get through. He laughed as he urged his tank on faster. However, he had no idea how far ahead he was or what Russia was doing. He looked over his shoulder and saw, of course, the interior of his own tank. This wasn't a car, it wasn't like it had rear-view mirrors. He turned back to the road and swerved violently as he realised he was almost off it. But he overcompensated and ended up on the wrong side of the road, even though it was the left side of the road and therefore actually the correct side, fucking continentals. Though, frankly, when you're driving a tank, who really gives a shit? Unsure of what side of the road he should be on, where Russia was, and lacking general hand-eye coordination, England continued to swerve. It was a good plan. Until a rogue tree jumped out in front of him and he crashed into it. Fucking trees! Wherever it was that they were, the trees were made out of depleted uranium or something because they didn't fucking budge. He felt another jolt and desperately tried to reverse. He reversed until he was blue in the face, but nothing happened. There was only one thing for it. He was going to have a look at what was going on outside. England popped his head out of the top of the tank and found that Russia's tank had crashed into the back of his. Russia backed up and then came forward again. England held on for dear life as Russia rammed his tank. Once he had his balance again, or most of it, in his state complete balance was probably asking too much, he waved his arms frantically. In due time, Russia popped out the top of his tank. "What are you trying to do?" asked England in exasperation. "Crush me?" "Am I not allowed to crush you?" asked Russia innocently. "No, you're not fucking allowed to crush me! Go around!" And just to make his point clear, England gestured to which around he meant. Russia ducked back down, and England watched as he reversed, turned slightly, and ploughed straight into the back of England's tank. Russia popped up again. "That wasn't a round!" cried England. "I am sorry, comrade. I thought that I would make it." "Well, you ruddy didn't, did you?" England was just a little stressed. Someone would definitely give him a stern talking to if he wrecked 2 tanks in one go. "This time, you should actually—" "Quiet!" Russia interrupted. England quietened. "Do you hear that?" England strained his hearing and sensed the far-off cry of police sirens. "Fuck," he said expressively. "What country are we in?" Russia took a drink from his bottle as he thought. How many bottles had he brought with him? "Germany, I believe." "Fuck," said England with feeling. "We should stand and fight," Russia declared, waving his bottle. "What, are you insane?" Russia gave no answer. "We should abandon tanks. I can't get caught by Germany again." "Germany is no match for us." "No, you don't understand," England pressed frantically. "He'll never shut up. He'll give a speech on health and safety so long you'll want to kill yourself by the end of it. And he'll make you fill out forms. Oh, God, the forms!" The despair on England's face was obviously very persuasive because the next words out of Russia's mouth were, "We run, then." Quicker than England could follow, though not necessarily actually quickly, Russia disappeared and then reappeared and exited his tank with a spare bottle of vodka. England followed his lead. What? Even enemies could have a good idea from time to time, and grabbed a 6-pack before he made his dismount. It was a far more messy dismount than his earlier one, and ended with him on his knees at the side of the tank. Russia grabbed him by his collar and dragged him up and onward as he ran by. The two of them ran as best they could, leaning against one another and trying not to drag the other down too much when they tripped. It was quite possibly the most cooperative they'd been in their entire history. "Into the woods!" gasped England, speaking from more experience than the average person. Together they veered off into the trees, undoubtedly by design, but it was hard to tell by just looking. They stumbled more over uneven ground, and the sirens grew louder behind them, but they soldiered on. The sirens stopped abruptly. Presumably the tanks had been found, and Russia and England hurried faster. "We will be heard if we keep running," said Russia, and he was right. The layer of dead leaves crunching under their feet was a dead giveaway. Okay, said England, his mind and his eyes searching frantically for a solution. He fixed upon a felled tree and steered towards it. Who knows what felled it? All England knew was that he didn't want to meet whatever it was, because if it could take down one of these tank-resistant trees, it was entirely possible it could take out a whole country. Russia followed willingly as England pulled him towards the log, and then watched with amusement as England made his inelegant way over it. Yes, look! England pointed excitedly. "There's room under here to hide." Russia leant over the log for a better look at the hollow underneath it, but he promptly lost his balance and fell over it, grabbing England in an attempt to save himself along the way and pulling him down as well. They lay in a small heap of drunken bodies for a moment before the, possibly imagined, sound of feet through dry leaves spurred them into action. Well, England was the more spurred of the two, knowing exactly what was at stake, and he pushed and shoved and rolled Russia right into the hollow under the log. England crawled in after and squashed himself in. Then he realised how uncomfortable it was and insisted Russia move his arm and his knee and pretty much his whole self until they were disturbingly close to spooning. But damn it, this was for survival. "You think we will be safe like this?" Russia whispered drunkenly, so he may as well just have said it out loud, tightening his arm around England's waist. Had his arm always been there? Did it really need to be there? Fucking dodgy, that's what Russia was. Wanker. I don't know, I hope so. Bugger prop addiction, he could worry about that later. England listened hard and caught the sound of footsteps through the trees. He hushed Russia in a way that would have given away their position if there had been anyone within a 200-metre radius, and hugged his 6-pack to himself. The two waited with bated breath. There were definitely footsteps. They came nearer, and England went so far as to hold his breath entirely, but they soon turned away again. England left it for another few minutes before he felt safe to move again. "Russia," he whispered. "Russia." He was whispering because, well, no idea really. God knows what was going on in his head. Let's face it, by this point he was just completely and utterly off his face. "Russia," he tried again, before he finally looked over his shoulder at the other nation, who was asleep. Well, that explained the lack of reaction. "Russia," he whispered again, urgently, and even shook him by the shoulder. He garnered no response. Russia was dead to the world. England huffed and sighed and swore quietly to himself and frowned at Russia's open and innocent face. It was clear he wasn't getting out from under the log for a while yet. Finally, he shuffled himself into the most comfortable position he could find on a forest floor, rolled up the spare ends of Russia's scarf for a pillow, and joined him in sleep. The end. Thank you for listening. If you're the anonymous person who wrote this, thank you for writing it. It is one of my very favourite things on the internet. So, yay. Thank you so much. I'm going to go and have a, I don't know, cup of peppermint tea or something.